Let's review the abandoned boxcar rule. So the abandoned boxcar rule says we're going to be dealing with just one comma. Usually we're going to see an independent clause first, then we're going to see a comma and then a dependent clause. The dependent clause should theoretically define the word that's right before the comma. Sometimes we're going to see it flip around. We'll start off with a dependent clause, have a comma, and then have an independent clause. In this particular case, usually the dependent clause is going to do one of two things. Most of the time, you're going to see it dealing with some type of a time relationship. In 1993, comma, I ran to the store. Okay. Second way that you would see it would be some type of an introductory clause that introduces the subject and then gives you the independent clause. Those are two ways that you are going to see abandoned boxcar. The most common way is to start off with an independent clause. Okay, the steps in the procedure to make sure that you get the sentence correctly analyzed is step one, go ahead, trace over where the comma is. The second thing after you trace over the comma is to go ahead, read and label the sentence components. I traveled from Los Angeles to Tokyo. That's an independent clause, so I simply put I above that. I move on to the second part. The most cosmopolitan city in Asia, that's a dependent clause. Now, step three is to make sure that that dependent clause defines the word right before the comma. The word right before the comma, usually, not always, is going to be a noun. The most cosmopolitan city in Asia, you see, gives you more information like a miniature definition of the word that sits before the comma, Tokyo. Let's go ahead and see how they're going to trap you on the test. Let's use our procedure. One, we're going to go ahead and read, trace over where that comma is. Boop, you see a comma here. I traveled from Los Angeles to Tokyo. We label step two, independent. Read the second component, where I met my assistant Zach. That is a dependent clause. You see how this so far is the exact same thing. Now, here is where we have to make a decision. Do we need a comma or do we not need a comma? Remember, the whole concept of a comma is to slow you down to make sure you understand what you're talking about. If we don't need to be slowed down, then we are going to just continue talking about what we're talking about. Does that make sense? I traveled from Los Angeles to Tokyo. Tokyo is the word that sits right there. That's the noun. And then this part should theoretically define what is Tokyo, where I met my assistant Zach. Does that define Tokyo? No. In this case, there would be no comma. Look real close at the difference. You see how in sentence number one, this is defining what we're talking about, and in sentence two, this is just basically continuing on. No comma. Slow you down to define what we're talking about right before the comma. Abandoned boxcar, kids. Let's apply the abandoned boxcar concept to practice problem number 32 on an ACT test. So first thing we want to do here is go ahead, scan your answer choices and pick something easy to work with. I look over here, I select answer choice H because there's just one comma. Step number two is to trace in where that comma is in the underlined portion. It's after the word could. Keep in mind that I disregard this because that is a different answer choice, which is no change F. The next thing that I would do is I'd quickly scan in here and see if there's any other punctuation in the non-underlined portion. Okay, if there is, I would simply trace it in there. There's a period here, so I just put a dot there. Okay, then keep in mind what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in the correct answer choice from problem 31, which is D, began. When I read the sentence now, I'm going to go ahead and label it independent or dependent. As my sister began telling me about the scorpion in her bed that stung her as she slumbered, I could. You see right away that that's a dependent clause. And then the next part, feel my eyes popping out of my head and my jaw dropping to the floor. That's dependent. Right away, I can cross out H. It violates abandoned boxcar. It's two dependent clauses connected by a comma. Remember, it's got to be independent, comma, dependent, or vice versa. Boom. That's out. Now I move on to the next answer choice. Let's go ahead and pick another answer choice. Let's try practice problem 32J. It looks like there's a comma after slumber and could. trace in, trace in. We'll read from the comma and stop. As my sister began telling me about the scorpion in her bed that stung her as she slumbered. That is a dependent clause. Kids, keep in mind this is super, super common. This right here sets off to make it a dependent clause. If you were to cross that out, you see that it actually would work. But because of that, that's a dependent clause. Then we have dependent clause here. I could, and then feel my eyes popping out. We already said that that was a dependent clause. This rule here is a different rule. It's 2 commas now. You see that 2 commas is Mr. Chung. It's non-essential information between the commas that theoretically we could cross out. Let's go ahead and check what happens to see if we cross that out. As my sister began telling me about the scorpion in her bed that stung her as she slumbered, feel my eyes popping out of my head and my jaw dropping. You see that that makes that an independent clause violation. Those crossed out does not make that a complete sentence. I can cross out answer choice J as well, violation of Mr. Chung rule. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next practice answer choice. I'm going to go ahead and take answer choice no change, 1 comma after slumbered. As my sister began telling me about the scorpion in her bed that stung her as she slumbered, it's dependent. I could feel my eyes popping out of my head and my jaw dropping to the floor. That's independent. That works with abandoned boxcar. Let's go ahead and put it up by that. We'll check just for fun, answer choice G, and see if G works. G, there is no punctuation in here, so we simply cross that out. That means that we have to read from here all the way to here without taking a breath. Watch and see what happens to the professor as he tries that. I get ready. As my sister began telling me about the scorpion in her bed that stung her as she slumbered, I could feel my eyes popping out of my head and my jaw dropping to the floor. It's a lot of stuff. I can barely make it. That doesn't work. It's too long. Answer choice F is going to be the correct answer choice because of the abandoned boxcar. We're going to go ahead and put a comma here because it's dependent and independent. Keep in mind, kids, this is very common that they start off with one of these little words here. If you were to take this little word here and cross it out, you would see my sister began telling me about the scorpion in her bed that stung her as she slumbered. That, if you cross this out, would make it independent. So be aware that when you start off with something like this, that makes it dependent. So be aware.